Hi guys, it's Pastor Ken here. Welcome to another online service for Every Nation Melbourne. And first of all, I just want to do a quick shout out to Arlo and Ling. So Arlo and Ling are both going to be a year older this week. So happy birthday, you guys. And I just pray that God blesses you and that you really, that next year, hopefully, you won't be in lockdown for your birthday. But, let's keep praying for the COVID situation here in Melbourne, and let's be believing for God to bring something good out of all of this confinement that we're going through. But we want to continue today our series called Priestly, and we're doing this series because we have this idea that there are priests in the Bible, and today we have priests, and they're the leaders of churches. They're the ones who are paid to do the work. They're the ones who go out there and then maybe if they're more of a mainline tradition, they have a stiff collar and all that kind of stuff. But actually, biblically, all of us as followers of Jesus, we are priests. We are all priests, and actually, all of us as human beings are made to be priests. We all have that potential to be a priest. When we give our life to Jesus, when we pledge our allegiance to Him, then we're kind of that priestly image, that priestly vocation is fully released in each and every single one of us. So we are all priests. I want to break that mindset that just because I'm the pastor of a church that I'm a priest. No, we are all priests. We are all made, even as human beings, we're all made in the image of God to represent God to creation and creation back to Him. And I love that our priestliness as followers of Jesus is wrapped up in the summation of the Torah, the 613 laws. Jesus distills 613 down to 2 and says this is basically what the law is all about. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength on the one hand, and on the other hand, love your neighbor as yourself. And then to be a priest is to be in between God and between our neighbor and even the rest of creation. Because that's what priests do. Priests stand between. Priests stand between God and creation. Priests stand between heaven and earth. Priests, as we saw in our first message, stand between the living and the dead. That's not just me as Ken Johnston, pastor. That's all of us who are followers of Jesus. We are all priests. And today, I just want to look at a man that God made a covenant with, that he would have a lasting priesthood. Because I think there's lessons that are applicable to us in this Hebrew Bible story that are applicable to us because we are all priests. And we're going to be looking at Numbers chapter 25, verse 6 to 13. It's kind of a little bit out of context. I'm just going to read it. I'm going to fill in the context and draw out some lessons for us. So Numbers 25, verse 6. Then an Israelite man brought into the camp a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, since he was zealous for my honor among them as I am. I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites. So it's a bit of an interesting passage, and in some ways for me even a bit of a difficult passage, but let me fill in the context. Israel has been freed from slavery. They've been freed to be a nation of priests to bless the world. Going all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, the third part of our story, God has a plan to bless all the families of the earth. Chooses Abraham. Abraham's descendants become slaves in Egypt. They're set free from their slavery, and they're set free to be a nation of priests that will bless the entire world. And they're stamped with the name of God. We saw that when we looked at how priests bless, the priestly blessing given to Aaron to speak over the Israelites. And the result of that priestly blessing spoken over the Israelites leads to God's name being placed on them. And then they're called to bear God's name, and to bear God's name not in vain. That's what we saw last week. Called to bear God's name on the one hand, not in vain. That's not just saying, oh my God, but it's to represent Him, and it's to accurately show who he is and his heart to the nations, but it's also that priests are called to bear the names of their neighbours towards God. Aaron, the high priest, would have the names of the 12 Israelite tribes on his chest whenever he went into God's presence. So that's kind of a bit of a summary of what we've been looking at these past few weeks. And that leads us up to where Israel is here. They're out of Egypt, they're in the wilderness, they're just wandering around, and they've been seduced by their enemies. They've been seduced by both the Moabites and the Midianites. And this is a detail that's quite often overlooked, but actually the Moabites and the Midianites, they're literally family members of Israel. They're the brothers of Israel. Moabites are descended from Abraham's nephew, Lot, and Midianites, they are literally sons of Abraham. After Sarah, Abraham has a wife whose name is Keturah, and she gives birth to Midian, a son. So literally these are half brothers of Israel. But once again, Israel rebels against God. They're in the wilderness, and they're wandering around because they rebelled against God. But they continue to rebel against God, and this time by being seduced. And this seduction has led to a plague. And we've seen in the Hebrew Bible that priests are often involved in dealing with public health issues. And the first message that we looked at in this series, we saw that Aaron had to stand between the living and the dead, and that was a plague breaking out. And because he stood between the living and the dead, the plague stopped. Here, another plague is breaking out because of rebellion, and a priest steps in to deal with it. And so that priest, this time, in the first time there was a plague, it was Aaron. This time it's Aaron's grandson, Phinehas, and he confronts the rebellion amongst God's people. What's happened is Moab, once again, these are relatives of Israel, has seduced Israel, and a plague has broken out. Now, an Israelite man has kind of doubled down on it, and he's taken a Midianite woman to worship in his tent. And so, what do I mean by that? So in those days, sex and worship of pagan gods went together. There was this ritualized sexual activity that would take place. People basically would have sex with the priests or the priestesses of the gods of the nations, and they would do that as their act of worship to receive. They would worship fertility gods and fertility goddesses this way. And if you think about it, what they were really wanting is they were wanting to have lots of children. They were wanting to have their ground be fertile, so they'd have lots of crops. And so basically they were worshipping a fertility god or goddess, but really they were worshipping an economic prosperity. They wanted more children to look after them. They wanted more children to do work. They wanted more crops so they could do more trading. And they're basically had to have extra fertility to have extra economic blessing. And to do that, you'd have sex with the priest or the priestess of these fertility gods. However, this Israelite man who's taking this Midianite woman, it's not just about having sex. It's about which deity Israel would choose to worship. Would Israel rebel against Yahweh and worship the gods of the nations by having sex with the Moabite women and the Midianite women? Or would Israel choose to be faithful to Yahweh? And, this is just a great example. Contrary to what our culture says, basically the Bible says sex isn't just a physical act that feels good. It actually means something. Sex means something. Sex matters. And I mentioned this before, and I'll say it again. This is a tough passage to read because Phinehas, he executes the rebellious Israelite and the Midianite woman. Phinehas does this, and God stops the plague, and he makes a covenant with Phinehas. He makes a covenant. This is what God says. Therefore tell him, I am making my covenant of peace with him, with Phinehas. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites. So we read in this passage, God makes a covenant with Phinehas because he was zealous for God and he made atonement. It's a tough passage to read. And it's a tough passage to read because of the violence that's in there. Phinehas, he's violent. He takes action. But I want to show you something in this passage. And I want to show you, first of all, by asking this question: why was Phinehas, this priest, Why was he praised by God himself? Why did God praise Phinehas? Is it because he stopped people having sex? Is it because he stopped interracial relationship? He kept the purity of Israel. He kept Israel away from their relatives of Midian. I don't think that kind of thinking fits the bigger part of God's story. I think it's because Phinehas was zealous for the honor of God. That's what God says. He was zealous for my honor. He was zealous for me. I think God praises Phinehas because he was zealous for the honor of God. But I think it means that he was zealous for the heart of God. To be zealous for the honor of God means to be zealous for the heart of God. And to be zealous for the heart of God means being zealous for the mission of God. So this is what Israel's rebellion was. Israel's rebellion, which caused the plague, was forgetting their mission. That's what Israel's rebellion has always been, forgetting their mission. Israel wasn't called to be like Moab. Israel wasn't called to be like Midian. Israel wasn't called to worship the gods of Moab or worship the gods of Midian by having sex with their priestesses. Israel wasn't called to do that. Israel was called to be a blessing. It was called to be a nation of priests. What do priests do? They bless. What do priests do? They bear names. They bear the name of God. They bear the names of their neighbors to God. Israel was called to bless them. Israel was called to show Moab and Midian, their brothers, was called to show them another way. The temptation for Israel the temptation always throughout the Hebrew Bible for Israel is to stop blessing the nations and to start being like the nations. Let me say it again. The temptation for Israel was to stop blessing the nations, because that's their mission, that's what they're called to, that's why they were chosen. To stop blessing the nations and start to live like the nations, start to worship like the nations, start to do economics like the nations, start to do human sexuality like the nations. No, God has a better way. Israel was set apart to be different, to show a better way, to show God's way, to show God's kingdom. And when things threaten God's way, when God's people are being seduced off track from who they are called to be and what they're called to do, to live their life for God and to be a priest representing him to the rest of creation, to bless all the families of the earth, when things start to threaten God's way, his priests are called to respond with zeal. They're called to respond with zeal. Oh, Ken, this is a passage from the Old Testament. What's this got to do with us? Well, we're called to respond with zeal just like Jesus. We talked about last week how Jesus is the perfect high priest who perfectly bears the name of God, who perfectly bears our name to God the Father. Just like Jesus, the true high priest, we are called to be zealous when God's people go off mission. Let me read to you from the life of Jesus, John chapter 2, verse 15 to 17. So Jesus, he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Jesus is the priest that is zealous for the honor of God. Jesus is the priest who is zealous for the heart of God. Jesus is the priest who is zealous for the mission of God. Jesus, he doesn't hate business. He doesn't hate people selling things and making a profit. He doesn't hate that. But what he does hate is people using business to stop people connecting with God. Where had all the money changers set up their business, their market? It was in the outer courts of the temple. What's the outer courts of the temple designed for? It was designed for the nations, the Gentiles, to come and to learn about God. That's where the nations would come and meant to be blessed by the Israelites. And here they are. They've set up this barrier. They've just made it about making money. What's this got to do with us? We are called to be priests. We are called to be priests who are zealous. Absolutely. Now let me just nuance that. We're not called to be zealous for the rules. That's what the world thinks we're all about. People think Christians are zealous for the rules. You can't do this, you can't do that, you should do this, you should do that. And no one likes that. No one likes someone who is holier than thou. No one likes someone who's zealous for the rules. You know, a rule Nazi. We're not called to be zealous for the rules. We're called to be zealous for God's honor. We're called to be, as priests, we're called to be zealous for God's heart, for his mission. We're called, which is, once again, God's mission is to bless all the families of the earth, to fix everything that's been broken, to bring in his new creation, to bring in his kingdom. We're called to be priests who are zealous, not for the rules, but for God's mission. We are called to bless the families of the earth. We're not, on the one hand, we're not meant to be like them, like the rebellion of Israel in the wilderness that Phinehas had to deal with. And on the other hand, we're not called to separate the nations of the world from God, like the money changers were doing. Both times priests reacted with zeal, because what we're called to do is to be different but be a blessing. Be different but be connected. Be different but show a better way, a new way, God's way. You know, there's, maybe just as we wrap up here, there's one key difference between Jesus and Phinehas. And Phinehas, this is what he does. Remember, Phinehas is commended by God, and God makes a covenant with him. Jesus, even more so, is commended by God. Jesus, even more so, has a covenant from God. Jesus is God, right? The Son of God incarnate, fully human, fully man. But there is a key difference between Jesus and Phinehas. Phinehas sees an Israelite and a Midianite rebelling against God, and he takes up a spear. In his hand, he takes up the spear and he executes them. You know what the key difference between Phinehas and Jesus is? Phinehas takes up a spear. Jesus, he doesn't take up a spear and stab someone caught in their rebellion. He doesn't do that. Instead, Jesus, he receives a spear. He gets a spear shoved into his side. A spear pierces him. He doesn't take up a spear. He's stabbed by a spear. Jesus takes a spear on behalf of the people caught in sin. Phinehas takes a spear and stabs those who are rebelling. Jesus takes a spear from those who are rebelling against him for the forgiveness of those rebelling against him. Because that's what priests do. Jesus' zeal as the true priest of God means he sacrificially serves. And that's what we're called to do as well. I want to challenge us, every nation in Melbourne. I want to encourage us. I want to cast a vision of who we can be as priests. Not just me as a pastor, but each and every single one of us who say that we're followers of Jesus. This is the challenge. These are the challenges. These are my exhortations. These are my encouragements. Let us be priests who are zealous for God. Not zealots, not zealous priests who are, going around Bible bashing people, but priests who are zealous for God. Priests who are zealous for his honor. Priests who are zealous for his heart. We say that we exist to honor God and make disciples, right? Cross-culturally. Let's be priests who are zealous for God's honor, his heart, his mission. Let's be priests who don't become like the world. That was Israel's eternal temptation, was to become like the nations instead of blessing the nations. Let's be priests who don't become like the world. Let's not be like Israel. Let's be like Jesus. Let's be priests who say, we're not going to become like you. We're not going to worship the same gods you do. We're not going to, in Israel's context, worship these fertility gods that will give us more children and more crops so we can become richer. Or in our context, I'm not going to worship how much money I have in my bank account, how much money I make at my job, what kind of house I have, what kind of car I drive, all this economic stuff that the world says we've got to have, all this material stuff. I'm not going to become like the world. I'm not going to fall for that trap. Let's be priests who don't become like the world, worshipping their gods of fertility, economic security, and comfort. But instead, let's be priests who bless the world with a different way, with a kingdom way, with Jesus' way. Let's be priests with a contextualized zeal. What do I mean by that? We're not meant to be like Phinehas who takes up a spear. We're meant to be like Jesus who receives the spear. We're not punishing anyone anymore. That's what Phinehas did. We're not doing that. Contextually, we need to be priests with a contextual zeal. In our context, we're not punishing anyone. We're not shaming anyone. We're not excluding anyone. And I mean anyone. Doesn't matter what they've done. Doesn't matter who they think they are. We're not shaming anyone or punishing anyone or excluding anyone. Because Jesus didn't take up a spear. Jesus contextualizes what Phinehas did. And he says, this is the zeal I want now. Instead of taking up a spear, receive it. Jesus didn't take up a spear. Jesus was impaled with a spear. Let's be priests who serve sacrificially, because that's what Jesus has done for us. We rebelled against Jesus, but he was the true high priest who received the spear, who perfectly, accurately bears God's name, who bears our humanity towards God the Father and stands between God and us, so that we can now stand between God and others, showing who God is, showing God's heart. No, Phinehas was commended for having a zeal for the honor of God. And that's how I want to be like Phinehas. I want to be commended. I want you to be commended. I want us at Every Nation Melbourne to be commended. You know what? Every Nation Melbourne, I commend you. You had a zeal for my honor. You didn't just say, I will honor God and make disciples cross-culturally. You actually had a zeal for my honor. And you had a zeal for my heart. And you had a zeal for my mission. And that zeal wasn't Bible-bashing, religious, rules-based zeal. It was a zeal for self-sacrificial serving and connecting and blessing. Every Nation Melbourne, I want to commend you for your zeal for my honor, that you loved me and the people around you so much that you didn't become like them, but you went to them to bless them. Wow. I think that's who God's calling us to be. Remember, we are all priests. Even as we go through this lockdown, let's say yes to this priestly calling. Let's say yes to this priestly posture. And let's be a blessing to the nations around us. Having a zeal for God's honor, God's heart, and God's mission. So let me just wrap up in a prayer. God, we thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jesus. Help us to be zealous for you. Not for rules, not for morality, not for politics or ideologies or sexualities or anything like that. We don't want to be zealous for that. That's what the world gets fired up about. We want to be zealous for you. And of course, being zealous for you is going to inform all those other things, but we want to be first and foremost, fundamentally, primarily, thoroughly zealous for you. Zealous for your honor. I mean, as a movement, we say we honor you, God. Help us to be zealous for your honor, which I think means being zealous for your heart, which I think means being zealous for your mission. So help us, I pray, God. Help us not to fall into the trap of Israel that had that eternal temptation. Instead of blessing the nations and forgetting their mission, they forgot their mission and they would become like the nations. God, help us not to become like the world, but help us to bless the world. Help us, I pray, to be like Phinehas, contextually zealous for your honor, for your heart, for your mission. God, I know that you will bless this city and that you will stamp your name on it. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen. All right, guys, that's it from me. Looks like we'll probably be online next week, but we'll see what happens. And as always, I'm Pastor Ken. Be blessed.